I was searching around for a V-shaped exposure like this, but in fact I have found one, but it's an upside down, an inverted V. It's very useful kind of structure to start off with when you're shooting something and you're not quite sure how to balance the ingredients. Everything rises to a point in the center. You can see, so the shot is running up the sides here like this, from the bottom of either corner. It's very bright at the top. It's a backlit sun, so I'm going to have to be quite careful with my exposure. I'll start at what the camera says, but I'll then do several that are much darker. Otherwise, I think we're going to run the risk of the sky being white. Having established this V-shaped structure, we've got a big tree on the left, our main subject tree in the center, slightly to the left, and interesting texture on the right-hand side. So I have 3 frames, 2 of which are really dark, but we'll see how they look in Lightroom. We have 3 exposures of my upturned V composition, all of which are extremely dark. Let me show you. This is them undeveloped in Lightroom, so everything's zeroed. So dark, dark, even darker. So if you're shooting this on a not very good camera, you might struggle with the shadows. The Sony is pretty good in the shadow detail, and we've retained some highlights. But let's just do Command U. Let's auto each of these. So the previous one and the first one. So this is the one that the camera said we should expose at. And as you can see, the highlights are very bright. Let's see if we could pull anything back. Well, according to this, there is detail in the highlight, but I must say I can't see it. Even if I pull this right down, there's blank nothingness. So my next frame, darker exposure. Again, it's not bad, but the highlights do go pretty suddenly here at the edge. And then my very darkest one, I think this is probably the best bet, this one. So I'm going to click Auto Exposure, and I'm going to try and pull back the highlights using a combination of the highlight tool and the whites tool. In Lightroom, the highlight recovery tool is very versatile, but only seems to go so far. It can be rather coarse in the way that it treats the kind of very edge between the highlights and the next tone down. The whites tool, on the other hand, seems very good at handling that transition. Gives you something rather smoother. So if I zoom in to this area that we're going to work on, and if we watch the white tool here, you see that's starting to give us a much better tone in these areas here, getting a kind of pinky, apricot sort of orangey tone in the sky. Now that looks pretty good. Obviously the frame as a whole is very dark, but the sky is looking good. I'm pretty happy with that. In a way, this is representing the tones very nicely. We've got this kind of lovely backlight on here, but it's extremely subtle, and if I was printing it, I think it would probably get a little bit lost. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and re-emphasize this V shape. So again, using the brushes, which is where I do most of my work, I'm going to increase the exposure and the contrast a little bit, and just lift up this V shape here to a point. I'm being very careful not to brush over onto the sky. That's looking nice. Now let's just see if I pull up the whites in this, we might get an overall brighter tone. That's lovely. But I like these darker branches running vertically through the frame here. So I'm going to pull down the blacks and see if we can get a bit more contrast in those while lifting the whites. So in effect, we're darkening the dark bits, lightening the light bits. We're increasing the contrast, but just in this bottom area. I'm finding the top left here a little bit distracting. I'm just going to try a brush to darken all of that. So a stop less, a very big brush. Maybe run that across the top of the frame. Then using another brush, I'm going to lighten up this tree here and the underside of these bushes. That's looking rather nice. So just a quick example to show you, if I make a virtual copy of this and reset the development to where it was, this is such a good example of how the thing you shoot in the camera is barely your starting point. It's a simple technical record of what was there in front of the camera, whereas what we're doing now, which is in the old school terms would be your print, is the interpretation of that stuff into making an artwork. So side by side, they could hardly be more different. Right, believe it or not, it's the same frame. This is another example of the framing shot where you're looking through something towards something else. There's a surrounding area around the picture and the main ingredients in the middle. The reason I'm keen to show you this is it will illustrate a very common problem with composition, namely two elements which don't really belong together falling in the same space in the frame. And in this case, it's the top of the gate and the horizon. The challenge often in a photo like this is to make it clear what's near and what's far. We're trying to give the illusion of space in the photograph. And when you have something very near coinciding with something much further away, it can often break that spell. And it's a simple solution in this case. All you need to do is lift the camera very slightly. Let me show you. So now we have these two lines kind of coinciding with each other. All we have to do is lift the camera. I'm going to keep going because the post on the left is slightly overlapping the horizon as well. And that's it, simple as that. It's only a few inches up, what's a foot higher maybe, and it makes all the difference to the shot. I'm on a very wide angle setting here, 16mm again, f10, 15th of a second, and I'm going to do a variety of exposures around that. Here are my 4 gradually darker frames, all shot at the higher elevation, so we're looking over the fence. These are all zeroed in Lightroom, so there's been no adjustments. So let's auto them all. They will look pretty similar to start with. And the main difference will be how much detail we have in the shadows and how much in the highlights because of the respective changes of exposure, which in this case are running from a 1/6 of a second, 1/4 of a second, 0.4 of a second, and 0.6 of a second, so quite a big range. And what we're generally getting is brighter and brighter highlights and less detail in the shadows. So in the brightest exposure we have very bright highlights but rather good shadow detail. Then as it gets darker, the highlights sort of improve, we're getting a little bit more detail, but the shadows are getting much darker. I think in this situation there is so little tone in the sky that matters that I'm prepared to let it go just to white. The important thing in a picture like this is that that transition up to that white tone should be soft and gradual rather than sudden and harsh around the trees. So I think I'm happy to go with my brightest exposure here. In particular because this gives us lovely tones here on the ground, and were you to have to pull these up from a very darker exposure, the colour and detail and noise would be much poorer than it is in this rather generously exposed shot. There's not a lot to do to this, I don't think. I'm going to use some brushes to pull up the shadows in a couple of the corners. So here I have about 1 stop of additional exposure. I'll probably need to back it off somewhat when I've painted it in. So I'm going to start in the bottom right here, a little bit here. This vegetation is rather heavy over the top, and these nearer leaves have got some very nice light coming through the back of them, which will be improved by lightening them a little bit. Same with these ones. Yep. So mostly what I'm doing really is I'm balancing up the exposure. We've got a lot of light in the center, much less here. The camera can't really do both. Well, it can do both, but by the time you get it on the screen, this is seeming very bright and this is seeming dark. So we're trying to compensate for that, increase the range that we've got in our picture. I'm very keen on all this detail down at the bottom, and I'm going to use the clarity brush just to see if I can pull it up a bit more, give it a little bit more bite. It's this foreground detail which gives the sense of being able to move into the picture. It's a very small adjustment. Let me just see if I can show you. There, so this is it, off and on. See, the problem is as it gets higher, you do lose some of the colour, so I'm going to be very careful about where I do it. Maybe add some contrast and lift the tone a little bit. Now the colour seems to have increased sort of slightly too much, so I'm going to back off the saturation a bit. This is just in this brush mark down in the bottom here, the one I've just done. So let's turn off my masks. So that's without, and that's with. One thing I've perhaps lost slightly is this sense of the framing, because I've lightened the corners, so I'm going to add back in a vignette, of course. And then perhaps an overall white increase, see if I can pull up the mid-tones. And that's it, looking pretty good, I think. Of course, there are hundreds of ways of composing your photographs. I just thought a few useful, basic, simple ones would be a good starting point. I find them particularly handy when I'm somewhere new, to look for kind of rigid structures, simple shapes, bold patterns. Once you start to become more familiar with the location, you'll find that more subtle and interesting things will gradually present themselves. And it's through taking pictures that you'll actually discover this. They tend not to kind of present themselves to you. Well, not to me anyway. I have to really work at it. The longer I spend somewhere, the more I find and the more rewarding a location becomes. I'm now going to run through the shots we've just processed and show you the before and after in each case. To start with, the before is the raw file in Lightroom with everything set at 0, so not auto-processed, nothing at all, just the basic data that's more or less come out of the camera. Here's shot number 1. In this case, the exposure is the 15th of a second at f10. All of these are 100 ISO. This is a stop or maybe 2 less than the camera thought. The meter would have metered off this large area here in the middle, not really accounting for the very bright highlight. If we'd gone with what the camera said, this area would have been lighter, but that would have been overexposed. This is a common characteristic in a lot of these exposures, that there are areas within the shot that are bright, which required a lower exposure in the camera to ensure that those highlight areas were preserved and had some detail in them. Then this is the processed shot where I was able to pull up the foreground a lot and the areas around it. I did think it might make a good black and white, so I tried this. So this is a fairly direct conversion in Lightroom. As often with black and white shots, it would probably need additional processing. The highlights are quite bright, but lovely silvery tones, I like it. Then the next frame, already pretty good straight out of the camera, but here we are, warmed up, bit of dodging and burning, balancing, cropping, 30th of a second to f10, pretty much exactly what the camera suggested in terms of the exposure. This next one was more or less the camera's suggested exposure as well. And here we've just darkened the foreground, brightened up here, pushed the tones down so there's a nice contrast here with the backlighting. And then the vertical version of the same shot. Similar treatment to last time. This brings out the backlighting really nicely on the trees here. Most of these shots would continue to be worth working at. I find that normally when I've processed something like this, when I go back to it, I continue to see little modifications that I might have. One here might be to darken this area here, just around the center on the tree in the background, which would then cause the backlighting on these nearer leaves, on the near tree, to be more prominent. This very nice tree trunk. And our processed version, warmed, rotated, a little bit of dodging and burning. This light and dark from light, dark, dark. And then a black and white version, which I think looks lovely, would make a fantastic print. The fact that this was shot with a good lens, focused carefully on a tripod, 100 ISO, focused carefully around about here somewhere, means that we've got sharp detail right in the very small pieces of grass down at the front. You could make even a very large print and still have great quality in all this. This one of the most striking differences between the before and after. So our basic raw file out the camera, then our processed one. The stitched version of this from lower down. And the same again. And the processed version. And again, I think this might make a nice black and white, so I just gave it a try. I like all the grasses here again. Black and white's very good for revealing textures in things. Our before and after. Going with the metering that the camera suggested, 15th of a second to f10. Pretty much all of these were too slow to handhold, so you really do need a tripod in this situation if you want to shoot at the lowest ISO, which will give you the best colour, best quality, best shadow detail. And the processed version. Then this one, which at a casual glance you might think, well, I've not got anything here, but actually I think it's one of the nicest shots. lovely saturated greens. This was 2 stops less than the camera thought we should be shooting at. That was intended to preserve the detail in the bright bits of the sky, which is pretty much done. And then our final shot, exposed somewhat brighter than the camera suggested, because I wasn't too concerned about retaining detail in the very strong highlight areas. I was keen to get shadow detail from these areas around here, which feels like this is more the subject than the bit in the middle. Then our processed version, where we have indeed lost highlight detail, but I think that's fine. We've got all this interesting stuff down at the bottom. And that's the lot. I hope you found this useful.